A low hum had become the soundtrack to Mark's increasingly isolated life. It emanated from the television in his living room, a relic of a brighter past that now seemed to pulse with a sinister energy. He lived alone in a small, slightly run-down house on the outskirts of Prescott, Arizona. The vast, arid landscape outside often felt more comforting than the darkened corners of his own home. Lately, though, even the desert held a certain unease, fueled by local whispers of things that weren't quite human. Stories of skinwalkers, creatures of Navajo legend said to shapeshift and bring ill fortune. He dismissed them as folklore, campfire tales to spook tourists. Until now. It started subtly, the kind of things you'd brush off as fatigue or a trick of the light. A flicker on the screen when the TV was off. A faint whisper that seemed to come from the static between channels. Mark, a pragmatic man in his late 30s, tried to find logical explanations. Faulty wiring. The wind whistling through the antenna. Loneliness playing tricks on his mind. He worked from home, a freelance graphic designer, his days spent bathed in the cool glow of his computer monitor, the television a silent, dark rectangle in the periphery. But the subtle occurrences escalated. One evening, while watching a nature documentary, Mark swore he saw a fleeting image superimposed over the serene footage of a mountain range. It was a face, gaunt and pale, with eyes that seemed to pierce through the screen and directly into his. He blinked, and it was gone. He rewound the recording, played it back in slow motion, but there was nothing. Just the majestic peaks and the endless sky. He told himself it was his imagination running wild, the stress of a looming deadline manifesting in bizarre visual glitches. He even checked online forums for reported issues with his TV model, but found nothing. The feeling of being watched intensified. He started noticing things in the reflection of the turned-off screen. A shadow that didn't belong. A momentary distortion of his own image, replaced by something else. He began avoiding looking at the TV when it wasn't on. He even considered unplugging it altogether, but a strange sense of morbid curiosity, a chilling pull towards the unknown, kept his hand from the socket. He started recording the television with his phone, hoping to capture some evidence of what he was experiencing. Hours of footage showed nothing out of the ordinary, just the blank screen reflecting his anxious face. Then came the voices. Not whispers anymore, but distinct, though muffled sounds. Sometimes it was just unintelligible murmuring, like a crowded room heard from behind a closed door. Other times he could almost make out words, fragments of conversations that seemed to be happening just beyond the glass. He'd press his ear against the cool surface of the screen, straining to understand, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. He started sleeping with the lights on, the glow a meager shield against the growing darkness that seemed to emanate from the inanimate object in his living room. One night, he awoke to a blood-curdling scream. It hadn't come from outside, it had come from the television. He scrambled out of bed, heart pounding, and cautiously approached the living room. The TV was off, the screen dark and silent. He stood there for a long moment, listening intently, but there was nothing. He was about to retreat when he saw it. A handprint on the dusty screen, as if someone had pressed their palm against the inside. That was it. He couldn't rationalize this away. He grabbed his phone, his hands shaking, and started recording. He circled the television, his voice a trembling whisper as he documented the handprint. As he zoomed in, he noticed something else. Faint scratches around the edges of the screen, as if something had been trying to pry its way out. Days turned into nights, fueled by paranoia and sleeplessness. Mark became obsessed with the television, constantly watching it. Even when there was nothing on, he felt a presence on the other side, a malevolent intelligence observing him. He started seeing the face again, not just fleeting glimpses, but clear, sustained images. The man inside the TV. His features were always the same, the gaunt face, the pale skin, and those piercing eyes that seemed to hold an ancient, terrifying knowledge. Sometimes the man would just stare. Other times, his lips would move, forming words that Mark couldn't quite decipher, but felt deep in his bones. They were words of hunger, of malice, of an unspeakable intent. He tried everything. He called a repairman, who found nothing wrong with the television. He consulted paranormal websites, his searches filled with desperate queries about haunted electronics and entities trapped within technology. He even contacted a local Native American elder, hesitantly sharing his experiences, careful not to sound disrespectful of their traditions. The elder listened patiently, his gaze grave. He spoke of skinwalkers, not just as shapeshifters, but as beings that could manipulate the very fabric of reality, blurring the lines between worlds. He warned Mark about inviting darkness into his home, about the dangers of dwelling on the unnatural. The advice did little to quell the growing horror. The man in the TV was becoming more active. His movements were no longer jerky and distorted. He would slowly turn his head, his gaze following Mark around the room. He would press his face against the screen, his features grotesquely magnified, his breath fogging the inside of the glass. One evening, as Mark sat frozen on his couch, the man in the TV smiled. It was a slow, chilling rictus that revealed rows of sharp, uneven teeth. That night, Mark had a vivid nightmare. He was inside the television, trapped in a dark, distorted world. The gaunt man was there, his eyes burning into Mark's soul. The man reached out a skeletal hand, his touch cold and clammy. Mark woke up screaming, the image of the man's face seared into his mind. He knew he had to get rid of the television. But as he approached it, a wave of dizziness washed over him. He felt an irresistible pull, a hypnotic suggestion that rooted him to the spot. The screen flickered to life, displaying only static. Then, slowly, the static resolved into the gaunt face. The man's eyes locked onto Mark's, and this time his voice was clear, no longer muffled or distorted. "You've been watching me," the man rasped, his voice like dry bones rattling. "Now it's my turn." A cold dread washed over Mark as he saw the man's hand reach out from the screen, the fingers long and pale. The glass seemed to ripple and distort as the hand emerged, passing through the solid barrier as if it were water. Mark tried to scream, to run, but he was paralyzed by fear, his eyes wide with terror as the hand reached for him. The hum from the television grew louder, filling the room, drowning out everything else. And then there was only darkness. The house on the outskirts of Prescott stood silent. The television in the living room was off, its screen reflecting the empty room. A faint handprint marred the dusty surface, a silent testament to the horror that had unfolded within. And somewhere, in the static between channels, a pair of gaunt eyes continued to watch.